Hello and welcome to our 7th broadcast of Ferment TV. I'm Natsai Audrey Chiesa, the founder of Baby Futures and Ginkgo Bioworks collaborator on Ferment TV. Today I'll be filling in for Kit, but before we begin, I have some housekeeping notes. As per usual, this session is being recorded so that we can share it online. We welcome and encourage audience participation in the chat and Q&A boxes throughout the conversation. Please don't leave your questions to the very last minute, as we'd like to allocate as much time as possible to them. Don't forget to upvote and comment on questions that resonate with you. Finally, stick around till the end where I will return to preview next week's broadcast. So about Ferment TV. For those who are new to Ferment TV, we are an experimental space for virtual gathering by Ginkgo Bioworks, created in partnership with a London-based agency, Baby Futures. We foreground multimedia storytelling from the world of synthetic biology. You're currently tuned into our launch series. You can visit Ferment TV to learn more about our platform and go to our YouTube channel to catch up on previous conversations. Today, we're focused on the theme of caretaking, holistic innovation for societal and environmental needs. I'm thrilled to welcome our speakers, Seetal Solanki and Maurizio Montalti, in conversation with Christina Agapakis. They will delve into how creative thinkers and doers are building holistic innovation frameworks for a new age of biotechnology. With over 15 years experience working in the design industry, Seetal Solanki is founder and director of Matter, a research-based practice working with brands, institutions, and industry to advance material literacy as relates to people, place, and planet. As an educator and a translator, her work centers on the implementation of context-based responsible material flows and design frameworks that make materials more accessible and relatable. Seetal is also the author of Why Materials Matter, which was published in 2018. I encourage you all to get a copy, and an educator at the Royal College of Art in London. Maurizio Montalti is a designer, researcher, educator, and entrepreneur. In 2010, he founded Officina Corpuscoli, a multidisciplinary studio providing creative consultancy and developing both commissioned and self-initiated projects, inspired by and in collaboration with living systems and organisms. In 2015, he co-founded Mogu, a design company focused on the industrial scale-up and design of mycelium-based materials, services, and products. And our moderator today is Christina Agapakis. She's a biologist, writer, and artist interested in microbes and the future of biotechnology. As Ginkgo Bioworks creative director, Christina collaborates with engineers, designers, artists, and social scientists to explore the many unexpected connections and possibilities that exist in the world of synthetic biology. Now over to you, Christina.
Thanks, Natsai. I'm so excited to talk to you guys both today. I guess I'm really interested in this idea. We're talking about paradigms and paradigms for design. And I think that is something that we've kind of been trying to weave together throughout all of the conversations, like new paradigms and new ways of working together with each other across disciplines and with biology. So I'd love to start maybe with having you tell us a little bit about your own histories, the paradigms you've worked with in design as designers, and maybe give us a little bit of a taste of how biology has been part of your practice or has maybe shaped a new paradigm for you. Well, who should go first?
Seetal, please.
Sure. Okay, thank you. It's a real pleasure to actually be here and discuss such a topic because I guess with my paradigms, I've trained as a textile designer, formally. That's my formal training. And I studied a course called Textile Futures at Central St. Martin's many moons ago now. So when it was in its infancy at Central St. Martin's, and it kind of really opened up my world to many possibilities of what was possible with textiles, because it's something that I've been questioning for a really long time, even previous to my master's, of what is a textile and what are its future possibilities within, say, architecture or, I mean, I worked across so many different disciplines because I was really trying to push the boundaries of what is possible and what alternatives can be created with textiles. So working in architecture, working in fashion, working in lighting, working in interactive installations, filmmaking in an amateur way, but nonetheless, that's something that I tackled, at least. Animation, automotive, definitely expanded across science and also food as well. So there was so many sorts of disciplines that I was able to kind of integrate myself into, just because I was really questioning the role of a textile designer as well as textiles within all of these sectors. And they were at different scales as well. But what was the most common sort of thread? Sorry for the pun. But there's no other word I could think of. But really, textiles.
Puns are allowed, don't worry. Welcome.
Maybe it lightens the conversation as well. But yes, it's basically materials was the conduit or the glue that actually brought us all together in all of these different sectors and disciplines, and actually opened up conversations with like production. I had to deal with, say, concept design, product design, fashion design, sound and engineering and structure, and so many different sectors. And materials was the thing that was constant, basically. It was just the output that was entirely different, and the scale was entirely different. And knowing that the materials was the glue, it meant that actually most of them, if not all of those industries, didn't really understand the capabilities of those materials, because I was potentially the only one that had the job of a textile designer or material designer. There's only one job that I had where I was actually called a material designer, a color material designer. And that was quite interesting, actually. That was in automotive. But if materials were integrated at the very beginning of the process, I think the outputs would be a lot more considered and much less wasteful. But in all of those sectors, the materials were kind of an afterthought, and therefore the behavior of those materials weren't really integrated much earlier on. So they were really misunderstood, I would say. Not only materials were misunderstood, but also my role was kind of misunderstood. And therefore this idea of misunderstanding led to, I would say, disrespect as well for the craft, but also for the substance itself. So I think that also leads on to huge issues around waste and consumption, because there's a lack of respect for where these materials come from and what they have to go through in order to create such products. And really my practice is based on framed on frustration. And it's really built on frustration, because I really want materials to be respected and the people that work with them to also be respected, because we need to all relate to one another in order to create a world which is one of caring and one of respect. And that is really my practice. It's about relationality. And those materials are creating bridges and hopefully kinships in terms of building a world in which we can actually co-create, actually. And one of co-creation is with materials. And ultimately, that's what I do. And I think there's a really great quote that Karen Barad, she wrote, I'll just read it actually. "The very nature of materiality is an entanglement, and matter itself is always already open to, or rather entangled with, the other." And the other is what our relationships are, basically, to them. So that's kind of what I do, really, and how I've got there. So it's been across the span of, like Natsai was saying, over 15 years. So my practice is almost 5 years old. So in September we'll turn 5, which is quite an achievement, I think, for me. So yeah, it's quite a milestone. So it's just the beginning, I think, as to what's possible.
It's really interesting how you were saying that you were something that kind of, or you and your focus on materials was something that kind of like brought together people, so many people who are trying to make and produce different kinds of things. But that the material, the matter that these things were made out of was something that was always taken for granted. So yeah, that just by calling attention to it and making that, making that visible, we pay attention and we don't waste that material, right? Yeah, we see it, we value it. That's really beautiful. Maurizio, do you want to give us your story?
Sure. Well, not trying to go way too back in the days, but certainly I've always been very much of a curious individual, very much fascinated with the different functioning of processes characterizing either production, but particularly as a young kid, looking at the ecosystem and specifically having a deep focus on the behavior and on the life of the agents from micro to macro, animating the rhythms and the functioning of the larger ecosystem. So somehow there was this kind of background, maybe quality that was rooted in a strong environmental responsibility and the wish to contribute to the establishment of, let's say, a renewed ecological resonance that we seem to have lost touch with. So somehow it's been a little bit of a mixed and interesting, strange trajectory, because my interests brought me to first study engineering to understand the nature of processes. And despite having discovered along the way that that was not really my deep fascination, I decided to keep going, and I graduated with my master in engineering. But during my recognized studies, certified studies in engineering, I also started exploring the design practice in an uncertified way as an autodidact, and eventually also started delivering and developing and delivering different types of projects, which allowed me at a later stage to access also education in design through a master I did in the Netherlands at Design Academy in Eindhoven. And it's interesting because yet again, once I finally found my place as a designer and I got recognized as such, I started dramatically questioning during my studies my role as a designer and the reason why I wanted to study design in the first place. I mean, I was very much driven by the interest of developing interesting stories, nice, pleasantly aesthetical projects and limited products that could embed a lot of different meanings, and so could work as conversation pieces and means for communicating different subjects to the larger audience. However, while confronted with the act of working with materials at hand, which is very much typical of the design educational background of anybody studying, at least in the Netherlands, so the designer is very much of the designer maker, I also started experience one of the greatest frustrations ever, being the one of needing to work constantly with synthetic materials at hands and not willing to be part of the funny game of developing and delivering and introducing the market products that beforehand will be problematic due to the impact that the materials they embed incorporate. And so I started exploring actually a subject which was not exactly what I'm doing these days, but is strictly related to it. That's where it all starts, is the genesis of it. I started looking at the convergence between this design frustration and exploring the cultural meaning of death as part of Western cultures particularly. And I started looking at the cycling of nutrients along the ecosystems, diving into the role of the different microbial systems that are responsible for undergoing cycles of decomposition and transformation of all matter, no matter if it's organic or inorganic one. So by focusing on the active role of the microbial agents, I had to dive deeper in the understanding of the biological processes animating such fantastic creatures. And to do so, I started getting in touch with the realm of the lab. I started knocking on many doors, and I luckily got accepted in some. Due to the experience generated together with the scientific colleagues that were informing me and forming me, also passing on knowledge not only about fundamental science, but particularly about the methods and the techniques for working with living agents, I had the opportunity to actually start exploring deeper the proposition of, if you wish, just bringing about a perspective that is more of a destructive perspective at the first glance rather than a constructive one. You could call it a design away perspective. So it was some sort of shocking and apparently unusual at that time proposition, rooted in the fact that designers, and particularly myself, can and should engage in processes of destruction rather than creation, which is also not something necessarily particularly new, because if you look at what the design discipline is characterized with, it's something that's always been done. If you think about innovation, innovation in itself is a deliberate act of destruction of some aspects of our current existence, because to make a new product, you make it means to have the intention to render the existing version of that product redundant. So I started investigating again the cycling of nutrients along different realms through the action of microbial systems, and by doing so, I started degrading materials in great amount and tackling the opportunity of working in cooperation with microbial agents for tackling the severe impact that we all know about, likely nowadays, in relation to the damage that we created through human culture to the larger ecosystem. And the more I kept growing agents for degrading matter, the more I kept witnessing the emergence of new organic matter. And this is where the perspective started shifting. So it became a new constructive objective, rooted though still in a destructive, or rather better maybe to frame it as transformative process that relies on, again, the action of microorganisms, and specifically in my case, fungi and fungal mycelium, for, again, transitioning matter in other forms and for the benefits of larger frameworks of agents.
That's super interesting. I'd love to, I don't have a question I get, but I think that there's something very beautiful, very interesting in what you're saying about biology as like this transformer of matter. Biology as something that sort of degrades but also creates new kinds of materials, and that's something sort of special and unique to biology, and to the materials that emerge from biological processes. So I guess maybe there's a question there in sort of, Seetal, when you think about materials and material properties and sort of engaging and communicating with materials, where do biomaterials or biological materials or biological processes kind of fit into your story of materials and how you think about them?
Yeah, this was one of my questions actually to Maurizio, because for me, biomaterials, or the word bio in the material world, is a really interesting one, and one that I'm questioning quite a lot, because I do a lot of work around material literacy, and it's something that I think is really, it's a really big word, it's a loaded word to kind of unpack in the design world. So the term biodesign or biomaterials, I'm actually writing a piece right now around biomaterials and their agency, actually. The fact that they're living substances, but so are we. And who gets to decide when it's ready? So this is something that I'm kind of deeply in right now in my headspace. So this question is like really timely, and also this conversation is really timely because for me, every material is living, honestly. So for me, the word or the term biodesign is one I question, actually, and one I would really love to question in this space, because for me, like, every material has a consciousness. I really believe in that everything has a life, and that life needs to be respected to a degree. So this idea within, say, my cultural context, so Hinduism, for example, I'm not a religious person, but I'm a spiritual one. But animism is something that is really, really prevalent in my culture. So everything has a consciousness. This idea of everything having a life is one where it's about relationality, basically. So we have to respect that other life, the non-human life, as well as the human life, in equal measures, basically. And for me, it's more about humans and non-humans rather than living and non-living, because for me, everything is living in some way, shape, or form. Even what's called an innate material, like mountains or rocks or these kinds of materials, they still have grown to some degree over time. Even if it's a long, long period of time, it still has the ability to metamorphic. Yeah, they have metamorphic properties.
It transforms too. Yeah.
Completely. And that's just over a longer period of time in comparison to, say, the material that Maurizio works with fungal mycelium, that has a much quicker growth rate. So the destructive part actually is really interesting, because that breaks down much more easily and much more quickly in comparison to, say, something like a rock, which probably it just erodes in some way. And that sort of lifespan, or the death of materials, I think is a really fascinating one. It's something that I think we all really need to pay more attention to and not fear, I think, because this idea of death, life and death, exists in everything. It's just, we have to understand it within different temporalities, basically. So I think within this current political system that most of the world is operating in, capitalism, the way in which we sort of observe material life is one of disposability and one of durability. So they work in actually happens in that kind of system is that it just becomes really toxic. The land, the people are suffering. There's kind of trauma happening across the planet, and also with the land, and also with human health. So actually, it doesn't encourage a nourishing life, an ongoing life, when we're like stuck with mountains of plastic piles, or we're just shipping waste from one country to another. And so I think this idea of multiple acceptance of difference, basically, this idea that there's not one way of doing things, or there's not one way of knowing, and knowing that materials all have different lifespans and death rates and life rates is something that we need to embrace more. So biodegradability versus durability versus versatility, there's so many things in between that. And these different states of temporalities and are really something that we need to embrace more. And that leads to different scales of production also to some degree as well. But yeah, I think this, please go ahead.
I was going to say,
yeah, sorry.
Well, maybe let me try to link it, but I wanted to go, to hand it over to you, Maurizio. I have a question. that kind of, in your intro, in your bio, it says, the company that you founded is about sort of scaling up and industrializing these biomaterials and the production of mycelium. And it is really interesting, right? Like it seems like you're both kind of getting at some place, but if through different directions, right? Like, so on the one hand, you want to sort of like bring biological or like living materials into our kinds of modes of capitalist production. And in the other direction, you want to sort of bring other kinds of materials, like bring biology or biologize our kind of conception of materials, for lack of a better word, right? Like recognize the living character and the transformative character of materials. And so I guess I'm curious for your, maybe Maurizio, what are you thinking about? Like, how do you, when you hear about what Seetal's saying, like, are all materials alive, and where do you fit in when you think about the destruction and creation of materials, living or?
No, I definitely resonate with the sensitivity also described by Seetal. At the same time, I'd like to highlight that what I audaciously refer to as the destructive approach is not only to be found in the temporality when looking at it in relation to biodegradability or so, but much earlier at the beginning of the process when looking at the opportunity that a living system, such as, for instance, fungi, can provide you with when tackling different types of residual, we call it still nowadays waste matters deriving from other processes, mostly often agro-industrial activities. And therefore, there is an act of destruction and disgregation inherently in the action of the organism tackling that substances in order to transform them towards something else. But what is definitely very important to reflect upon, and it's a sensitivity that is diffusing ever more, but not yet widely enough, is the fact that we have or are starting recognizing as a collective society that we are in an absolute need to create new relationships with what we call nature, whatever notion or meaning people might associate with it. It's a very trivial word, and with the other species, in order to what? In order to survive ourselves first. So putting life and the others, any others, the fellow human, as much on an equal level, the other living and non-living agents, instead of just humans at the center of our professional practices, can transform us and therefore can transform society through the comprehension of the interrelational dynamics that exist between all these different domains. So there's been a lot of different models, of course, that have been popping up along the recent past decades, from cradle to cradle design to sustainability design, circular design and circular economy, and biodesign and bioeconomy. Now, all, besides being very misleading to the understanding of the person not skilled in the practice or working in the field, all these approaches and innovation can though function as inspirations for envisioning new narratives and activating different types of critical dialogues that can bring a number of perspectives that range from ethics to materials, from technology to philosophy, from biology to business, moving beyond the traditional, how they call it, HCD, human-centered design, moving towards an overall inclusive perspective that takes into consideration all other beings contributing to life on this planet, call it LCF, the life-centered design, or as to use the terms of other people, multi-species design.
Yeah, I kind of call it planet-centric, actually.
Yeah, it really becomes a matter of lexicon also to avoid any bias in relation to the specific meaning that we often associate with one term. But so to actually come to my point, the design problems that we face consist of very much multidimensional, complex systems issues that cross traditional disciplines and traditional knowledge sets. And that's essentially what we have been trying and are still attempting, having already some positive results, doing through a practice such as industrial practice. That is what Mogu is nowadays, a scale-up industrial company. Nevertheless, in order to actually make that work, again, you need to rely on a number of competencies and skill sets, and be able to communicate across different mindsets within a landscape, which is the industrial commercial landscape, which to a certain extent is the very one you criticize in the first place. And nevertheless, in order to tackle it and in order to change it from within, you need to work with. Which is highly controversial because, of course, there is something strange when talking about, again, this empathy towards the other and this relational aspect, the other intended as the non-human in this case, and still the exploitative nature of the processes that are daily conducted in each and every lab in the world, or any kind of biotech driven company in the world, where in the end we even call them in science they tend to be called the microbial systems workhorses, which is quite significant of the approach with which we work with the ones that I define as my partners.
Actually, what do you think of the term biodesign, Maurizio?
I dislike it.
Okay, good. So do I.
Just to give a very blunt answer, I find it actually just well, I understand the necessity for it to have born, also to create a parallel to a field that is has been established since much longer, such as the one of bioart. However, if you start looking at at what it has become a big pot where everything that contains any kind of compound or molecule or product or derivative product that has any organic quality can be put in. So no matter if it's something that comes from responsible or irresponsible processes, or a mix of the two, or if it comes from processes rooted in biofabrication and microbial growth, or if it comes from a regenerative process that implements agricultural waste mixed with some whatever traditional synthetic compound, anything has become bio. And to me, the word bio is posing one of the, besides the good that it embeds, is one of the terms that we should mostly avoid, as it's one of the greatest threats that contributes to create great confusion across the audience we try to interact with, due to the fact that the audience is not necessarily rooted enough or educated enough for understanding what a certain terminology, biodesign could be one, and there are many other words that use the suffix bio at the beginning, mean effectively.
Yeah, I completely agree. Sorry, Christina. I think it's really misleading a lot of the time, but this idea of language within the design world is something that I think is really being questioned quite a lot at the moment. But this idea of somehow branding design in these terms, like biodesign or material design even, I think is really quite questionable, because every designer works with a material. Why do we need to like pigeonhole people to become material designers, for example? Or why does biodesign have to be a whole sort of other framework or another paradigm, so to speak? These sorts of shifts kind of are happening because we are moving into spaces where it's more transdisciplinary, rather than it being one of where it's just about the single vision of a designer. And designers not just designing for designers anymore. Actually, it's one where we're actually designing for others. And when I say others, I think it's also keeping in mind of other beings like the planet, this idea of moving away from human-centered design to a planet-centric one. And that sort of shift has to really happen through language a lot of the time, well, at least initially. But the language that's being used currently within the design world is one where I think it becomes quite sort of loaded in expertise rather than one that feels accessible or even relatable, because it's kind of quite disconnected somehow, and also one that feels a bit far removed from society. And I think that is sort of lending itself to like branding. But I think when we talk about relationality and accessibility, it has to begin with language. And it's something that I'm deeply kind of in research phase of at the moment, because I'm shifting the language and the vocabulary that I'm using in my practice to one where I'm calling myself a translator rather than a designer. And that's been quite an intentional decision, framed on the reasons of the fact that I have to create multiple types of relationships with people from different expertise, or even just the general public, or even trying to speak to materials differently themselves. And also, I think that's one where we have to really understand not only language, verbal language, but other types of languages or other types of intelligences. So one where it's about listening, one where it's about observing, one about embodied intelligence, material intelligence, and these kinds of other languages, but also practices. And there's a particular project that I've done that Matter has been part of in Bali with Potato Head. So they're an independent hotel, and they call themselves a creative village because they are really about community. And there's this particular hotel opened up earlier this year, and it was designed by OMA, and it also allowed us to not only visit the island, but also understand what the island of Bali is made of through its materiality. And that was an exercise where we had to map the island of its materials, and that would be local materials, native materials, and also its, in quotes, waste materials, because they have huge amounts of plastic washed up on their in their oceans. So it's one that's in abundance, those resources. And I would say resources because they're really, very problematic, should I say. And so by mapping the island of its materials, we also got to understand what skills existed on the island and what sort of ancient, I don't want to say traditional, but like ancient practices of craft actually existed, and who were the people doing those practices, whether it would be working with rattan, or whether it be working with bamboo, or whether it be working with volcanic lava stone, or this really incredible material, which are like fronds that are just like naturally sort of molting from the palms. And this is a material that is called ijuk, and it's a material that gets utilized in, say, the thatching of the temples, Balinese temples, which is incredibly insulating and very protective. So it was just an incredible sort of trip in terms of really immersing ourselves in a space where we got to really understand what this place is made of, and through skill, through exchange of knowledge and skills, through practices essentially. And even there's a natural dyeing practice there, studio there, which could actually dye by using black. They created a black natural dye, which is so rare And that was like the most enlightening thing I think I experienced, because that's virtually impossible, I think. And that kind of mapping allowed us to understand the many potentials these materials could have within the space of the hotel, which was like 170 rooms, public spaces, restaurants, and all sorts of things. So it was enormous. It's like the biggest project I've ever worked on. And we could express these materials through their sensorial qualities, their properties, their personalities, their behaviors, by understanding how to actually relate to them in their context and their cultural context. Because with Bali in particular, it's one of creating balance. So within their culture, which is also Hinduism majority, I think we got to work with people like Max Lam and also Faye Toogood and all sorts of other incredibly talented practitioners to have this exchange of skills and knowledge of these materials, which then got actually implemented in the hotel. So plastic got used as roofing, recycled plastic got used as furniture and all sorts of things. And the way that it was expressed, had multitudes. And this idea of materials being translated across these different products or uses or expressions was one of translation, basically. And also the exchange was one of translation. So even calling myself a designer in that space was one which was quite problematic, because it was one of hierarchy. So I felt very uncomfortable in that space to call myself a designer, because they saw me as superior to them, and I'm clearly not, because they know way more about that material than I do. So it kind of reframed how I would start to position myself. But say in like in London, for example, a designer's value here is one of very different value. As a textile designer, if I would describe myself there, it would be one of like, oh, can you make me a dress? Or can you actually sew me a cushion? So it's kind of undervalued in some situations as well. So yeah, I think vocabulary and language is one I think is really, really, really crucial. And that is one of nuance across different cultures as well.
It is really interesting. I mean, it connects so much to what you were saying before about like your practice over time, and how you've kind of, you connect to materials, and materials themselves as something that's taken for granted and disrespected and sort of undervalued, that then what kind of emerges from that is a set of practices, right, or values, the work of translation and those relations that are themselves also undervalued. It's like you're sort of and taken for granted. So it's like you've found sort of both the materials and the practices that are undervalued, and you're elevating them and bringing them together like very deliberately in your practice. I guess I don't want to throw out biodesign altogether, because it feels like there could be something like that, right? Like that biology itself is something that we take for granted. It's something that came up a lot in the conversation we had with Daisy and Drew a couple of weeks ago, right? Like that we don't often think about, bacteria until, they're doing something bad, right? That we undervalue the sort of power of biology to build and grow and to make materials in our kind of industrial modes of thinking, and then we also undervalue some of the values or practices that might emerge from working with biology, the nurturing, the kind of gardening approach to working with biology, and so to me, I guess it seems like that's what biodesign could be, and so I guess I don't know. I guess, what do you think about that? Both of you.
No, please go, Maurizio. I will also add to it. Yeah.
I think it's a good hunch also to connect what Seetal was saying, and also one of the questions I saw popping up in the chat from Andrea. Certainly, we underappreciate, we do undervalue the role of microorganisms in general, and that's generally a cultural problem that is also very much originated through different factors, one of these being also the aging culture that characterized the previous centuries, and our decision to classify all microbial individual, let them be species, strains, whatever, into just one category as something harmful. We need to live a clean life, and without really understanding the fundamental interdependence that exists between us and them, which are just part of us, essentially. But nevertheless, what is interesting is that we also underappreciate the qualities that are offered to us by the microorganisms themselves when expressing along their growth a certain language. And we can talk, and here I'm trying to connect to the focus on language that Seetal was reflecting upon. There would be a symposium needed to actually explode the whole subject of language in design or language in materials. However, I find quite an interesting contradiction also in my experience when looking at the incredible fascination and wonder that I experienced, and still I do experience, when I started at the beginning succeeding to grow my first, say, biocomposites. So I was feeding my fungi with some different nutritions deriving from low value residues and so on. And eventually I ended up having these nice blocks. I don't know, I can take, for instance, something here in the back. Now, this is maybe not the most representative, but certainly this is not an industrial product. It's a rough brick that is already being standardized enough by the means of the use of a mold. And nevertheless, still it expresses quite a quality. It's a material language. It's a material quality. The material speaks the language of the very process that brought it to life, as opposed to any of the materials that surround us mostly in our everyday life, which are all perfected, hyper-stable. On the contrary, this not living, once living material has some transformative qualities to it that are expressed through its texture, through its feel, through its morphology, and so on. So actually, indeed, the language of materials is the most seductive factor that we tend to get fascinated and seduced from at the beginning. And yet, culturally, and that's what industry asks for, because that's what, dirty word, the consumers, the users are asking for. We all want something that behaves perfectly, it's hyper-stable, feels always within the same range of performances and technical qualities, and so on. And particularly, we like to have products or things surrounding us that last for long time, as opposed to recognizing the fact that anything existing should be cycling and should be naturally programmed for cycling across different states of matter. And this is a fundamental problem when actually coming to impact, and if you wish, start part or contribute to start an industry which yet is not so hyper established, like the industry of the synthetics, the chemical industry, and needing actually to comply to the requests of a system that go completely against this type of sensitivity, and that oblige you to actually try and satisfy to the best of possibility the request of the users or of the market for having something that yet, yes, is 100% natural, possibly biodegradable, if not even compostable in your own garden, and so on, and it needs to perform as the toughest polycarbonate. There is something weird about our cultural approach towards material, and certainly in order to further evolve, technically we can do great progression, and it is possible to standardize also biological processes, as we partly do already nowadays, towards stable, inert, and performative products, technically performing products. But we should possibly in the long term, and that would be the greatest disruption that our society needs perhaps to go through, we need to let go of all our obsessions with this idea of permanence. We need to embrace the transitory quality of everything existing, and we need to embrace cyclicity as something that we feel first and foremost for ourselves. If we are able to, and I go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, if we are able to embrace and understand the notion of death as a fundamental complementary part of anything that we define as life, we are possibly going to be able to really also promote the emergence of a new material culture, which possibly can be much more respectful of the relationship between us and the ecosystem we are part of.
So maybe this is a good moment to transition to some of the questions in the Q&A. I think there's a thread that we can kind of weave through a lot of the questions. Many of them are asking sort of this question of like, what are new paradigms, right? Or kind of what are new kinds of those themes or values that are kind of emerging from this conversation, from your work, from the work of from our kind of understanding of biology and from materials that bring us into the kinds of future that you want to build, right? So I guess the question, yeah, we started from your history and the paradigms that you've sort of been trained through and what's gotten to you to today. I guess that now maybe a question is like to look forward, like what are new paradigms for design or translation or biology? There's questions here about co-op or sort of like more accessible models of design. There's questions about what responsible design looks like and societal shifts. There's also questions about ownership, which I think maybe plays a role too in how we think about the life and death of objects. So I don't know, just to kind of close us out with sort of final thoughts like in that direction.
Yeah, I can add to that actually, and it leads nicely on from what Maurizio was just describing and discussing with us, because I think this cultural relationship we have with materials is something that is being reframed and needs to be reframed, and that's the paradigm shift we need to kind of experience. So it's really questioning the role of us humans and the role of us as designers, and because designers are humans of some degree, right? And even we can think that nature is part of design, but design has traditionally been something that or conventionally been one of control, and one I think that is being questioned entirely by even what you're doing, Maurizio, with the mycelium, because you're having a dialogue with it. That exchange and that dialogue and that conversation you're having with that material is one where I would say our roles are one of stewardship and one of caretaking and one of guardianship. And that really, for me, is actually this whole conversation is framed around caretaking. So that as a paradigm shift is really, really important. And that really lends itself to this idea of our relationship to non-humans as well as humans is one where we are actually caretakers, actually, and that's our role. And that means we can have a more sort of a relationship which is one of equality somehow, and one that we're starting to listen, one that we're starting to engage, and one where we're starting to observe and understand one another, and therefore become relatable and also accessible. And that for me is where we're kind of heading, and I've actually built a framework which lends itself to that. So we always begin with the material and understanding its life and death. Actually, probably it's death first, and that lends itself to understand the material, the immaterial qualities of that material, and that's one of the invisible, I would say, and that's perhaps one of values or one of spirituality, and then it moves on to the virtual as well. And then that lends itself to understanding what our role as an individual is. And for understanding our role as what an individual is, we understand what our role is in society, and therefore build a community around that, which is framed on values, and then it moves on to the planets and what our role is towards the planet, and then it leads on to like spectrums of scales and time frames, and one of multiple futures. So this idea of building many worlds within a world is where I think the paradigm shift needs to be gearing towards.
I very much appreciate actually and subscribe to what you're saying, Seetal. If not, the only reflection I have is also about the fact that I fully share that as an individual and yet as part of my studio practice. However, in the moment in which you transfer yourself and wear the hat of the company and within the functioning of that and the dynamics of that landscape, despite those values being seated also in that reality is animated by very, very different forces. Which tend to put practical aspects very much on top of the list. In general, I think, particularly in an industrial activity, but in any activity, to be honest, it's important for designers and for the industry to also learn, talking about paradigms, that's something that's maybe been missing or it's not been present enough, to be able to trace, and it's not easy, the metabolic effects that of what we implement through the system. So today there are some, but not many incentives available for doing so, because government regulations, our economic capitalist system, they tend to ignore the relationship between self-interest and common interest, or the tight relationship that should be considered among all types of capital. Another dirty word. Could be natural capital, could be physical capital, could be human capital, non-human capital, social capital, and eventually also the economic and financial one. So design-driven decision-making processes should definitely consider and work within the complex interaction between those forms of capital. I think that it really all comes down eventually to what you also mentioned, to matters of honesty and care, which are not necessarily the main drivers in industry, unfortunately. So if we consider environmental constraints and the overall disgraceful situation that we experience nowadays, design, biotech, and even more society at large need to shift their objective from the quantitative to the qualitative, from a culture of producing to a culture of perhaps reproducing, but not intended as a scale meant as volumes. I need to reproduce items so that I have a great production volume. And then therefore I can compete in the jungle of the market. But on the other hand, reproduction intended as propagation, as seeding ideas and diffusing sensitivities or materials through, it could be through the cultural role of design, or it could be through the materials and the products of which we need to become, because they were living, or possibly they still will be living, the caretakers. We become the caretakers of a garden of opportunities composed by materials, by products, and by living systems that we appreciate the function of. But being the gardener also means having a very, very active and attentively demanding role, because you need to be pruning, you need to be weeding, you need to be composting, you need to be fermenting.
Exactly.
And so yeah, it's a little complicated, but that's, I think, where we should really lead them, what the paradigm should essentially be about.
And I'll just add one last thing, sorry, I know we haven't got much time, but qualitative and quantitative can be measured together. I think the coexistence of the two is where we need to be, and that's the paradigm shift I think we need to be edging towards, because I think the qualitative isn't measurable right now, but it has the possibility to be measured in a completely different way to what quantitative science or data is measured currently. So that's something that I'm edging towards, I would say.
Well, we are out of time, unfortunately. I wish we could keep talking for a lot longer. I'm definitely feeling inspired and excited about this new paradigm and motivated to work with you to bring this to life. So thank you both for a really, really beautiful conversation.
Thank you so much for everyone who has attended this session. Before I tell you about next week's episode, I'd like to extend our sincerest thanks to our guests, Seetal and Maurizio. Thank you so much. And to Christina for moderating today's broadcast. I'd like to thank Kit McDonnell at the Ginkgo Bioworks team, and at Faber Futures, Laura Bent, Joanna Mann, Camille Thierry, and Magda of Malcolm. So next week, I'm excited to share that we finally broadcast the previously postponed conversation between WGSN's Lisa White and the Extrapolation Factory's Chris Wilbekin and Elliot Montgomery. Behind a backdrop of profound uncertainties arising from a post-COVID-19 world, we will return to this theme of futuring, revealing how prediction and speculation are performative tools that can actually create the future. Please visit Ferment.tv to sign up for that broadcast. And also to sign up for our newsletter, which keeps you up to date with forthcoming broadcasts. Don't forget that you can also revisit past conversations on Ferment YouTube's channel, and you can follow us on Instagram via ferment.tv. Thank you for joining us today. We will see you next week. Take care.